There's a lot of discussion right now about the new versions of the player classes coming out in the 2024 Player's Handbook. But in my view, there is one class in the game that has always lagged behind its potential. Starting as a prestige class, moving into some sort of arcanist, and now largely positioned as a variety entertainer and magic user, the Bard has a long and rocky publication history. In my opinion, the Bard has been watered down over this process a little too much, and has ended up fulfilling a strange role in at least its community perception as some sort of hot musician type. And from the rumblings about the 2024 Player's Handbook changes, I don't think this community perception is really going anywhere. From what we've seen so far, it seems the Bard is moving almost exclusively towards a performer, multifaceted entertainer type. A minstrel, really. And from a historical and flavour perspective, I'm not sure this is the only way that we could go. I want to make clear up front that I am not some sort of rose-tinted nostalgia baiter who wishes the game would go back to what it used to be. What I really want to do is explore the difference between historic bards and their modern fantasy counterparts, and make the case that we really should be looking at two different types of character when we discuss historic bards and fantasy bards, both of which have a place in the modern game. So, what was a bard in real-world history? There is no doubt that they were performers. The word bard comes from a Celtic profession, referring to poets and sages who were employed by lords to write verse and perform said verse for them. A bard was one of the most important people in a Celtic court. They wrote and performed verse to entertain the guests, performed classic old songs, told folklore tales, and even wrote funerary elegies for the lord's honoured dead. Most of the time this verse was spoken or speak-sung to the accompaniment of music, also played by the bard simultaneously. But the key universal commonality of all bards is not music. It is the composition and performance of poetry. To do this, then, a bard needed to be skilled in memory, writing, rhyme, performance, history, heraldry, and folklore. But these Celtic bards were not the earliest bards, just the first to be called by that specific name. Bards predate our understandings of the Celtic people's written or oral histories, which, with the exception of Ireland, the written history begins essentially when the Romans come to these isles, which is also the point where the Druidic faith and traditions die. From what we know about these ancient Druidic peoples, they also had bards, who were skilled storytellers and knowers of things, and who may have been trained at central academies. But non-Celtic cultures also had bards, even if they went by slightly different names. Perhaps most famous among these are the Aoidos, like Homer, who is reported to be the author of both the Iliad and the Odyssey. A key thing to note is that though Aoidoi were known for performing and writing their own verse and accompanying it with music by their own hand, these proto-bards were far less tied to specific family, clan, or courtly practices. Partly due to the geography and politics of ancient Greece, small island kingdoms could not necessarily always afford to pay for a full-time poet to be at their court. And with the value placed on the spoken word as education in ancient Greece, we see a lot of these proto-bards travelling quite some distances and performing for a fair few people, not just the wealthier individuals at court. Homer, if such a specific individual actually existed in the 7th or 8th centuries BCE, would have travelled around the entire Aegean Sea, stopping off at various islands to perform his epics at various courts and for the local people. In reality, he was something of a travelling educator, using folk tales and epic stories to try to educate the Aegean peoples on their own history, their own culture, and their own folklore, the battles that their people had won, and the great heroes of their previous ancestors. Unlike travelling musicians and entertainers, who would later be called minstrels and troubadours, despite both those terms starting out, at least, in courtly circles, like the Celtic bards, bards were expected to be experts in verse and lore. And like we see with Homer, this doesn't mean that they didn't travel and didn't do things. To demonstrate how historical bards aren't boring, we're going to look at three very, very different figures. Two of these come from one work, the Divine Comedy, and the other is a 17th century Scottish man. Through these characters, historic, semi-historic, and fictionalized, I want to demonstrate just how different the historic conception of a bard was from, say, our modern fantasy musicians who share the same name, and how there is immense value in representing both at the table. First, I want to discuss Dante, the author and indeed narrator of the Divine Comedy, and Virgil, his guide through the layers of hell and limbo. Both have a pretty reasonable claim to be bards. Dante himself was an avid learner, thinker, politician, and philosopher. He was a student of faith and of medicine. He held public office in Florence and participated vigorously and personally in many political, social, and military movements, including the violent, fractious drama of the Guelphs in Florence, from which he was exiled for his participation. It's a dramatic life of politics, soldiering, schism, and most of all, poetry. The protagonist of the Divine Comedy is based on Dante. It's semi-autobiographical, and it's the protagonist's job to explore the afterlife, learn the lessons that the afterlife can teach, and bring those lessons into his personal life so he can end the tale with a stronger commitment to the Christian God. In the world of the tale, it's the story of an everyman who needs to renew his commitment with God. And in a metafictional sense, the Divine Comedy is part political commentary and part political/religious manifesto. Without a doubt, it is poetry that speaks directly to power, using the shared language of Christian imagery and politics to speak ill even of popes. Alongside of all of this social critique, this carefully crafted wordsmithing, the fictional character of Dante is also undergoing a great adventure, possibly one of the greatest ever recorded, as he explores and survives the entire way through hell, purgatory, and even heaven. Leading him through hell, however, is Virgil. It is more useful here to think of Virgil as a fictionalized character rather than an attempt to represent a historical person. Dante kind of bridges that gap. He is both historical person and protagonist, but Virgil quite clearly sits in that latter camp, largely because, well, Dante never met Virgil, and Virgil was dead for over 1,000 years by the time that Dante was writing his epic. Virgil's spectre in the Divine Comedy is certainly a bard. Virgil becomes wanderer, guide, and explorer of hell, almost like the great mythic hero of Orpheus. He is a denizen of limbo and is an expert in all of hell's strangenesses. He always knows exactly what to do, even when it's not obvious. When confronted by Cerberus, he balls up mud and chucks the mud into the monster's gullet to satisfy its hunger. And he uses pacifying words to convince Charon, the ferryman of souls, to convince him to leave Dante's soul alone. At every turn, Virgil is an expert in the lore, practices, solutions, and challenges of his land, telling Dante off for social faux pas, and all the while importing lessons and folklore about the people down here, all while using verse, knowledge, practical solutions, and divine power to guide the protagonist through Inferno. While Dante the character and Dante Alighieri both represent the human attempt to learn and understand things, and the ability of bards to critique and subtly jab at their opponents through masterworks, Virgil clearly demonstrates the expertise, oratory skill, and folk knowledge that any courtly bard is required to possess. And now to a figure who ties our image of the historic bard together. In my mind, the man often called Ian Lom, or Ian the Bald, or even John MacDonald, is the archetypal bard for this precise type of storyteller poet with expertise and a steady hand in practical matters too. Ian was a bard for the Scottish MacDonald clan in the 17th century. He composed poetry, fought in battle, and even composed poetry about fighting in battle. But he was also a multifaceted expert in clan lore, folklore, and was even made poet laureate by Charles II. The story that cements Ian as this perfect bard of this archetype comes around in the 1660s, when his local clan's council put in place to guide the clan until the former chief's sons came of age, conspired to murder the two sons. Ian was outraged. This was a clear breach of clan law. So, despite the fact that the council was actually ruling fairly competently in the sons' absence, and therefore wanted to keep their own power, and that many of his contemporaries weren't actually that annoyed about this move, he nonetheless set out to a local branch of the MacDonald clan to entreat that chief to bring this council to justice. When he was turned away by even this chief, he headed across the land, across the sea, to the Isle of Skye, where the clan chief of the entire MacDonald clan sat. This chieftain was outraged on behalf of the boys for the horrific act, and on behalf of the bard for being turned away by what should have been an authority. Ian convinced the chief to give him the letters of fire and sword, which is about as cool as it sounds. It was a signed declaration allowing him to legally execute the 7 murderers. He secretly arrives at a home which contains these 7 individuals and personally decapitates each and every one of them using the exact same sword that they had stabbed the chieftain's sons with all this time ago. And then he delivers these 7 heads all together to the other chief, who refused him help, as a warning to see what happens if you choose not to follow the clan law. This poet, this bard, personally executes 7 murderers because of his strong-held belief in clan law, while also being the poet laureate and the most comprehensive source we have on multiple historic battles in the Scottish Highlands. That multifaceted skill set, the knowledge that he had, the insistence to follow the law, the audience with the king, the ability to carry out practical tasks, and the knowledge to write correctly about all sorts of matters from warfare to heraldry, is exactly what I mean when I say that this is an archetype of bard that we just don't see in modern fantasy anymore. I should also mention the Nordic Skalda, who I don't really have time to get into today, but definitely give them a look if you want any extra information, because they are kind of the archetypal warrior poets in many cases. But I've completely excluded the entire entertaining industry of medieval Europe, after which our modern bards are kind of ostensibly based. These entertainers have many names throughout the medieval period, from jongleurs to minstrels to troubadours, and these are all slightly different, so we're going to go into a couple of these and discuss exactly how this entertainer became our modern understanding of bards. Minstrels were entertainers with the broadest of skill sets. Indeed, Giraud de Calençon, a troubadour in his own right, states that such minstrels should be able to Speak and rhyme well. Be witty. Know the story of Troy. Balance apples on the point of knives. Juggle. Jump through hoops. Play the citole, mandora, harp, fiddle, and psaltery. This is alongside any specific specialist skills like musical farting, imitating birdsong, or getting naked. Minstrels were a variety act, all rolled into one person, who would sometimes even be sponsored by lords to wear the lord's livery, demonstrating that they were, 1, a professional, and 2, that the lord was a patron of the arts. Here we really do see the jack-of-all-trades nature of the modern fantasy bard, and some of the randiness and scandal that becomes associated with these particular characters fairly often. Troubadours, on the other hand, are closer to court bards. Their main job is writing new verse, not simply retreading the old classics or doing kind of silly performances. They're more on the old school bardic side as well, because they focus on kind of rich romantic verse and have strong ties with nobility. Many noble families produce some of the most famous of the troubadours. One classic tale of this period sees Blondel, a troubadour, travelling from castle to castle to try and find the kidnapped King Richard the Lionheart. Blondel stops outside each castle, sings the first half of a tune that he and the king composed together, and hopes that the king's response is heard. When he heard the second half of the song sung from within the castle's walls in a hearty voice, he knew the king was safe, and where to send a ransom. This story is intensely ahistorical for a number of reasons, but as Terry Jones points out, it sent a message to the courts of medieval Europe. Look after your minstrel, and he'll look after you. By the 14th century, troubadours had become masters of subtle satire, somewhat in the same vein as the jesters that we enjoy in our medieval things, although the jesters are probably more close to minstrels, multi-talented fools, as opposed to biting satirists, although there was an awful lot of overlap between the two. Yet by the 16th century, minstrels were kind of gone from the courts and were starting to die out even in the regular public perception. Multifaceted performance artists of all stripes with all sorts of strange talents, paid by the court to put on variety shows, were a thing of the past. These talented folks specialised. They became musicians, acting troupes, composers, or playwrights like the famed Bard of Avon, travelling from court to court rather than permanent placements as travel became easier and less dangerous. And it really took the advent of new media to bring the variety show minstrel back into the spotlight, however problematic those shows may be nowadays. The troubadour, for their part, was also replaced at court eventually by specialised performers like Mozart, Paganini and Liszt. And as the courts of Europe die, decline, or are revolutioned, troubadours start to disappear until such a point that troubadour starts to become synonymous with minstrel, and minstrel becomes synonymous with eventually some deeply problematic shows. For its part, bard as a term has disappeared as well until the revival brought back by modern fantasy media. Although this revival hits bards much closer, I hope you'll agree, to minstrels than anything bardic that we've so far discussed. They're more like minstrels, travelling musicians, jesters, or even rock stars. So why does all of this matter? Because D&D does have provisions for different kinds of bards. Ian Lom may well be represented as a sword or valour bard. Lore bards, like Virgil, are a thing, and glamour bards show the appeal and magnetism that guys like Franz Liszt had. Seriously, look it up. And there's many other archetypes besides. The issue is twofold. Bards are spellcasters, in 5th edition, full casters at that. They use performance to weave their magic through verse, song, art, and dance. But all magic in D&D is performance. It requires intonation, requires you to speak certain words, make certain gestures, and use certain materials to fulfill the requirements to bring magic to the world. It also requires knowledge. And I can buy a kind of classic historical bard brought up in the traditions of his land, having understood the folklore, understood much through his education, picking up very potent magic in his time as a servant of the Lord, or perhaps ranging and wandering around, talking to people and understanding even more about folklore and folk magic. But is that the same guy as the wandering minstrel or musician, the jack of all trades and master of none? Perhaps our archetypal sexed up musician travelling from town to town. I'm not sure that that quite fits with a full spellcasting repertoire. The second issue is tied to this. For far too long, our pseudo-medieval fantasy worlds, and even our pseudo-Arthurian ones, have relied on classic tropes, like the court wizard. As far as I can tell, this comes from D&D's original creators being a little too into Arthurian legend, and therefore making all of their worlds work kind of like they have Merlin in them. Merlin, the archetypal court wizard. But Merlin, like kind of all his contemporary court advisors with some magical capability and some mythic knowledge, in real life, in the historical period he would have been a bard. A lawmaster, knower of magic and rituals, expert in royal history, lineage and magical folklore. Bards, in almost all cases, should be the ones at the side of royalty, not court wizards or warlocks. Court wizards should be training at bardic colleges, not just for the historical reasons I've outlined, but because it actually just makes sense. A king or lord needs culture and art in his court to entertain his guests, to entertain himself, and to keep his legend, his lore, and his family history alive in song. Because song is magic. Verse is magic. Besides, having a hyper-charismatic person as the king's right-hand man, who is also very well equipped to do all sorts of magic that helps people get along better, seems like the kind of perfect court vizier. I don't know why so many pseudo-medieval fantasy worlds stick so closely to the wizard angle in court mages. I hope the weight of discussion of the historical bard has been enough to convince you of this as well. But what of the fantasy bard? The wandering minstrel, entertainer, dancer, singer, actor, who isn't part of some specific royal court, or isn't wandering from court to court, but is entertaining the people. The multi-talented everyman with more skills than you can shake a stick at. The everyman who keeps people happy. I hope I'm not the only one here that sees a small connection with witches, and not just from Terry Jones's wonderful quote, "Well, if you help out your bard will help you," sort of thing. Wanderers, generally in the medieval period, were weirdos with strange jobs, like religious ascetic, soldier, entertainer, or outlaw, or, to put it in other words, clerics, fighters, minstrels, and rogues. This was a job. It was a profession, much like bard was. It required you to be clued into local politics, rivalries, news, drama, and have an ever-changing repertoire of brilliant, amazing skills to impress the crowds. And it strikes me that a sort of hedge mage type of trope fits this sort of a character far better than, say, some grand arcanist. Maybe more on the line of sorcerer than wizard or arcanist. This is all to say that I believe that the fantasy of the multi-talented minstrel type, the entertainer who travels and is able to summon magic through his very art, but also has a variety and litany of other skills, should be a half-caster. Give them more skills, give them some scrappy combat potential like the Swords Bard does, and give them some unique spells like Paladin and Ranger so that it feels good to be a minstrel. Because let's be honest, we don't need 3 different flavours of full charisma caster. The new player's handbook is going to contain, Bard excluded, 5 full casters, 2 half casters, and 4 marshals, and many of these marshals have magic subclasses as well, by the way. In my opinion, Bard makes a lot more sense in this arrangement as a half caster, with perhaps a potential to boost it to a full caster with one of the subclasses. Perhaps you could even make that Lore Bard. Although, to be honest, I think Lore Bard completely misses the mark on trying to recreate the historic Bard's role in court. They should get additional expertises, not additional proficiencies, and any feature that isn't just, yeah, you get to learn some random cool spells from other classes. But that's a rant for another time. In any case, this may end up being the most poorly timed video in history, as on the 11th, in a few days, they're revealing some of what's happening to the Bard in the new player's handbook. Feel free to pop back into these comments in a few days to tell me exactly how wrong I am, or how far I am away from Wizards of the Coast's actual intentions with the class. But with that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungin Master. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.